Good afternoon and welcome to the regular scheduled meeting of the Minneapolis Board of Estimate and Taxation for February 28th, 2024. My name is Steve Brandt and I'm the president of the board. At this time I'll ask the clerk to call the roll so we can verify the presence of a quorum.
Commissioner Fry.
Here.
Abene.
Here.
Payne.
Present.
Chuktai is absent. Priest Stinson is absent. President Brandt.
Here.
There are 4 members present.
I will now acknowledge, thank you, clerk. I will now acknowledge that we are meeting on the land held by indigenous peoples historically, and we remember their presence. We'll proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access on the city's Legislative Management Information System, which is available at lims.minneapolis.mn.gov. That's lims.minneapolis.mn.gov. Board members, the agenda for today's meeting is before us. May I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second?
Okay, we have a proper motion before us. Is there any discussion? With that, seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay? The ayes have it, and the agenda is adopted. Next is acceptance of the minutes from the January 24th, 2024 meeting. May I please have a motion to accept the minutes?
So moved.
Second?
Second?
We have a proper motion before us. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed? The item is, the minutes are accepted as presented. And item 4, which we will move on to now, is the acceptance of public comment. Do we have any comment today, clerk? Clerk informs me we have no public comment, so we will continue with the next item on our agenda. I just want to remind the public that there is an opportunity to comment on the work of the board every meeting, and urge people to take advantage of it. So item number 5 on the agenda is receiving bond requests as listed in the transmittal memo for the board, for which the Board of Estimate and Taxation will now consider approving the issuance of bonds at a future meeting. This is a receive and file item today. Mr. Hoppy, will you be doing the presentation?
President Brandt, no presentation was planned for this item.
All right. Maybe I can ask my colleagues whether they have any questions about this item. For the public's benefit, we are receiving bonding requests from the City Council and the administration for issuance sometime in the future. And we will be, these fall generally into 3 areas. One is bonds that are sold to finance assessments that will be paid by the public on typically street projects. We also have bonds that will be sold for utility projects, and then we have a third category of bonds that will be sold for general public works and buildings and grounds purposes. So I'll ask the clerk to receive and file those, receive and file this item. Item 6 on the agenda is a discussion of our options regarding the renewal of the Abdo Financial Solutions contract. And I'm going to give a bit of background on this, and then I will turn the matter over to Commissioner Priest Stinson, who is entering the room. And I will ask her then to take it from there. As you may recall, we have a not-to-exceed contract for $175,000 with Abdo to provide financial services and analysis to our board. They have spent $134,000 to date. The contract was for a 1-year period with 4 renewal options. None of those renewal options have been exercised at this point. However, the capital audit that was undertaken is sort of the major work by Abdo in this past year is unfinished. There are some revisions needed. The contract terminated as of the end of 23. we would need some sort of motion to extend if we wanted additional work done to finish the capital audit, or if we wanted ABDO to continue. ABDO has estimated to me that it would cost $7,000 to $12,000 to complete the work on the capital audit that they began, and the revisions that were pointed out. So with that, I will recognize Commissioner Priest-Stinson for additional comments and whether she has any particular recommendation as the person who sort of managed this contract during 2023.
Thank you, President Brent. Just some additional context. Again, we all know that all of you in your actual elected roles have staff. So this is a staff person that, while it does support the BET, does directly support the two individuals that are elected from the public. The first year that I was in the seat, we did not have anyone. So that was learning a little bit about what I might need and what not. There is an administrative need for things that's difficult to get from an external committee because of just the nature of how things work. They don't have the relationships, they don't have access to Outlook to look up who to email, setting up meetings, having meetings. That part didn't work out as well as one would need. And it's also a lot of work to manage a contract. It's not so much the dollar amount, but for what we need, it's more work than what I would have liked to see, and not the amount of support, not specific to ABDO, but just going external, to me, just didn't meet our need. I will also add that my initial support was behind a staffer, which previously we did have. And how we got to agreement around trying a consulting firm was being split between a full-time or a part-time person within the role. And so we had some that landed with the last iteration of elected BET, and they waited to allow for us to make that decision as the new BET coming in. It is my recommendation that it is best to go back to having a staff person, and preferably one who is between a part-time and a full-time, but it would be eligible for benefits. It's difficult to get the diversity that you need from having a part-time role. It's difficult to do a part-time role and not be able to take care of your body and the bodies of the family you're responsible for. And so I would like for us to consider moving in that direction and away from posting another RFP. The first RFP, we hardly got anyone. The second RFP, we had one new one, but we counted the previous ones that we declined as part of that to meet diversity metrics. I don't see why we'd expect a different outcome this time. And for that reason and all the other ones, I would appreciate thinking in that direction and thinking and making sure that the elected people to this body have the support that they need, that they are stating that they need, that every other BET previous to us has had. Thank you.
The clerk has a resolution. Will the clerk please distribute the resolution? And once members have the resolution, if I could have a motion, please.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Priest-Stinson moves, Payne seconds, and is there any discussion?
Mr. Clerk.
Mayor Fry.
Yes. Has any of our staff from finance seen the resolution yet or had an opportunity to review it?
It was, I believe, was it on the agenda?
The resolution, I received the resolution this morning. It was not on the agenda.
Okay, all right. No, then apparently not.
I mean, so, Mr. President, one of the main reasons why we've gone with a consulting firm in the past as opposed to a full-time employee is that we have staff at the city already that can do this work on a daily basis. If you look at the several bullet points that are in the description of what we're looking for, about 2/3 of those items can be done by existing staff. In other words, we don't need to hire more. And so in the interest of making sure that we're overseeing what we're doing in terms of taxation and in the interest of, spending our city's dollars in the most responsible way. I would oppose this resolution of going back towards either certainly a full-time position and a part-time position, instead contracting for the work we need done. I have no issue whatsoever with contracting for the necessary independent work as it comes up, but I don't think we need to hire out further when that work doesn't necessarily necessitate it.
Is there any other discussion?
Yes.
Commissioner Priest Stinson.
Just to make sure I understand what you're saying, Mayor Frere, are you saying that you don't have a problem with consulting with another firm, or would you be fine if we put out an RFP where we contracted an individual who could do that work? Just to make sure I understand what you're saying.
Good question, Madam Vice President. I have no problem at all with contracting with an individual or a firm. And so if there is some interest in going out for an RFP to look for either an individual or a firm that would meet the needs of this body, I would strongly support that.
Okay, is there any other discussion? Councilmember Payne, Commissioner Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a new member of the BET, but someone who is newly elected as of the formation of our legislative, executive, new structure on the city side of the government, one perspective I'm approaching this from is a structural one. And, I think I want to separate out whether or not we should have a full-time staffer or a part-time staffer or a contract staffer from the structure of having an independent body called the BET. And as somebody who actually didn't support the executive, mayor, legislative council ballot amendment, I take the fact that our residents supported that very seriously. And so I am very earnestly working towards doing a really strong implementation of that so that we have a very effective form of that structure of government. And likewise, I want us to have a very effective form of BET as a governing body if we so choose to maintain an independent BET. I don't think I'm hearing an argument of, abolishing the BET. That would be, I think, a very much larger conversation than whether or not a $175,000 contract is the appropriate way to handle the administrative needs of this body. But as long as we have an independent body, I want it to be a strong and functioning independent body. And if we're going to have a different conversation about that independence, I'm open to it. I am still learning about how BET functions and what its strengths and weaknesses are as an independent body. But until we get to some larger philosophical conversation about the effectiveness of its independence or ineffectiveness of that, I think that we should earnestly implement it as it is intended to be a strong functioning independent body with dedicated staff.
Additional discussion, Mayor? Commissioner Fry? Oh, Commissioner Benny, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think this is a really good discussion, and I think that the thing that really I'm connecting with is the idea that this was actually successfully performed, this function, by staff in the past and for many years. 30 years, I believe, is the number I've heard. The other thing is this is not an additional amount of money. This would just be allocating money from what's going out to an outside consultant now that might not even be in Minneapolis to somebody who is employed at the city at a level where they can receive benefits. I also hear what the mayor's saying, and I'm wondering about that the existing staff has the capacity to do some of this work. And to me, I think when you staff something as a one, you always, that person eventually will go on vacation or something. You always need a little bench strength. So I would hope that there's a model that also allows for some redundancy from the finance department, I'm assuming, is where it would be staffed. So I personally, I'm a little in favor of the idea of staffing somebody that can get to know this work, be available to particularly the two elected people. I mean, I'll also say as a park commissioner, we really don't have staff either. But we have relationships inside the organization and we have committees and things like that. But anyway, I can really see your point, particularly if you want to bring something new that hasn't been discussed in the past, a new perspective, a new focus area. This would give you the flexibility to do it that I didn't see come out of the contract relationship, because the contract relationship doesn't know the city government, I believe. So those are my thoughts.
Commissioner Fry and then Commissioner Chutai.
Thank you, Mr. President. So we had a pretty extended debate about this during the last term. And what we found is that there wasn't anywhere close to enough work for a full-time employee. And it wasn't even remotely close. And there was pretty substantial analysis that was done on this. While there would be work for a part-time employee, depending on the number of hours, it was difficult to retain a part-time employee to do that limited number of hours for a lesser pay. And so the conclusion that was then arrived at was to then contract. Now, if you look at the work, and this is important, if you look at the services to be provided that are described in the packet, the first four, no dispute, the first four should be done by an independent person. There is zero dispute there. So provide independent analysis of tax levy and property tax data. Independent. It should not be from somebody within finance. Provide independent analysis of bond issuance. Absolutely. Provide independent analysis of budget data. Absolutely. Review capital projects, et cetera. Absolutely. No dispute whatsoever on any of that stuff. That should be an independent person, as we are an independent commission. The remaining 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items are all things that our staff already do. They have been doing. There's no way of skewing the agenda or skewing the work one way or another. So the lack of independence there, even if we would argue that it's not independent, it doesn't matter. And so what I would propose, again, is whether it is an individual that we are contracting with or it is a firm that we are contracting with, both kind of the same idea, but either way is fine. But from our experience in the past, again, it doesn't make sense to hire full-time because there's just nowhere close to enough work. And part-time gets really tough because nobody wants to do it for that level, or at least we have not been successful in that in the past. That's why we arrived where we have been now. And so what I would support, again, is an RFP that would go out for the contract.
Commissioner Chutai.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've got a couple different and related things that I want to talk about. Really appreciate this discussion. I tracked the discussion around the staff member that previously existed that supported the Board of Estimate and Taxation, and the discussion around that very, very closely last year. And I'll admit I really disagreed with the conclusion that the board ended up coming to eliminate that position. Now, as we look to the future and the decisions that are in front of us, when we, I see the one option of, continuing down the path of hiring a financial consultant that supports the board in carrying out its functions. I think that is an option. It is just fine and good. Nothing wrong with it. But I would say, the financial consultant that currently works with that supports the board is also the same financial consultant that works with the Office of City Auditor, specifically the Oversight and Evaluation Division, which supports the council in carrying out its oversight functions. And I think there is actually a benefit to both the council and the board that perform different types of financial oversight for the city broadly, for that technical expertise to come from the same group of people. I would say as the budget chair for the city, I find that would be of benefit. I'd also say, as the budget chair, if the functions that are performed by this board weren't assigned to this board specifically, those would live in the committee that I chair. And so, you could say that I have perhaps a a greater incentive to see the benefits of that. And I don't. I actually think it is really important that the Board of Estimate and Taxation exist. I think it's really important that the two members who are elected citywide are a part of it and continue to perform the functions you do. The council does so much of the financial oversight of our city. We're the primary holders of financial oversight within the elected city enterprise. And the board is an important part of that, and the independence and the ability to actually perform your duties and your responsibilities with accurate or not accurate is the wrong word here. I don't want to assert that there's inaccurate information ever being shared with the board. I don't believe that's true, but to have independence from the enterprise is actually really important. And so, I would say, I appreciate that this is an at-will part-time position. I would support a full-time position. I really would. I think it's important. And, when I hear Commissioner Abene's point about, having one person creates I think this is not the language she used, but it's a bottleneck essentially, and I would support more than one person being supporting the functions of the BET. I'd also add, we're arguing over a 0.7 FTE, in the recommended budget that the council received for this year, last summer. 110 new FTEs were created. So I think if we somewhere in the ballpark of 110. If we can do that as the city, I don't understand why we're arguing over one person supporting the two other citywide electeds on this body. Thank you.
Commissioner Priest Stinson.
I also would just like to add, as far as it comes up often about stewarding the money well, and we don't have a lot of money on this board, but we don't have an office. We're not using cell phones. We don't have any of that. So when we do our community engagement or have meetings with constituents and others, which we do, we don't even have a place to go to do it. There's already money savings happening there that if we wanted to have that argument and have that, we could, but we don't. So there's already a lot of savings that happen simply by the will of the two elected people being willing not to have things that other elected people do. And I don't want to feel as if because we get paid less to do this work, that means that our positions are any less important or that we don't have those needs. And I agree with, I don't think we're arguing. I think there's several different solutions that could all be the solution. And I think the two people that are in the elected role are asking for the solution that fits best. And without making an HR issue, there were specific reasons why the last FTE chose to not stay within the role. And it wasn't simply because they had a need, and I can leave it at that. But I would argue against the fact that it's never been able to work out, because that's actually not true. And while I do appreciate the work that went into doing an analysis, I'll speak for myself. We never actually got a recommendation. We got a bunch of information and were specifically told by HR, which it was at a difficult time. HR was in the interim of current director outgoing, and we had an interim, but they gave us several pages of information that was helpful, but were unable to, no matter how many times we asked, they were unable to give a recommendation. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that the recommendation was that we shouldn't. It was information that we should use to base our decision on. That's what they continued to tell us over and over and over. I know President Brandt and I kind of pushed on that. So what is the actual recommendation? And so I'm speaking from experience. I'm speaking from someone who actually is an HR director in my day job, that this would be advantageous for all. And yes, there's staff more than qualified in our amazing finance department that could do the work, but we're not asking for them to do the work. That's not their charge. And it is important to raise up the point of the independent nature of this body. That is very important. And we are, in many ways, we're an oversight. And again, President Brandt and I are the only two folks that don't have any other skin in any other game, except for this one thing. And so on top of everything else we said, I would like to see that we can move forward with the solution that will work, especially for the person that has to manage that work. and what comes out of it, and anything new that they may want to see. We can't expect that the elected folks that will sit in these roles are going to keep doing things the same way they've always been done. There's nothing that says that we has to, and in many ways we haven't. So we should be able to have that flexibility like any other elected official to try to do things different and carve another way and find another path and have a staff person that can help us forge those paths. It would have been very helpful, for example, when we were working to get the public housing levy funded. It would have been amazing, actually, to have an in-house staff person, for an example. So I'm asking for support of the Brant resolution today. I would like to see it as it is written.
I'd like to address the issue. I think everybody else has had a chance to speak. I come at this from a recognition that the board has a history of close to 100 years, and in that time, it has had only 4 executive secretaries. I think the last one served 38 years. I don't think the workload has gone away. I'm sorry, the last full-time one served 38 years. I don't think the workload has gone away, and what that has provided the board has been a powerful amount of continuity that we have lacked with a part-time person. Now, my preference as well would be to have a full-time executive secretary, but this is a compromise on my part, and I think on the part of Commissioner Priest-Stinson, a recognition that some on the board don't feel that the position merits, based on the job analysis that was done, a full-time position. I think one flaw in the analysis that was done 2 years ago is that it didn't take into account the other duties as assigned that we farmed out to the consultant, in this case, the capital audit initially, and I had 2 more on my plate that I was hoping that Abdo would get to, but that didn't happen. Looking at the accuracy of the 5-year financial direction levy projections, for example, and the factors that have affected those, or the sufficiency of the city's debt program to meet the city's capital needs. You may recall several years ago, our then debt manager warned that there was going to be essentially a shortfall between departmental requests and what the city had budgeted for its capital program. What do we get with a staffer? We get more accountability. We have a closer working relationship. We get a better response from city agencies. Abdo has told me that they had difficulty finding the data they needed and getting responses from city departments. And I'm not speaking here specifically of finance. They tried to get data from a variety of city departments. I also come at this from the standpoint that there is more power concentrated in the mayor's office under the charter change that was approved in 2021, and I actually supported that. But my understanding is as well that finance reports to him. It does also, at least on paper, report to us, but I think the real accountability is to the mayor. And I think that we need a center of independent analysis. So that, for example, when we get a bond issuance request, we're sure that none of the bond authorizations have expired, as happened a couple of years back, or that we haven't exceeded the amount of bonds that were authorized for that particular issue. So I also want to address this from a financial standpoint. Over the last 4 years, the Board of Estimate as an entity, as a financial entity, has had run a surplus of $268,000 compared to budget. And the reason that money was unspent was that a couple people were hired on a part-time basis and didn't stick around because at halftime they had no benefits. And this is an attempt to get it to at least a benefit eligible level so that that won't be a bar. The third quarter financial projection projected that at the end of, it was an Abdo product that projected at the end of 2024, the Board of Estimate would have a budget balance of $185,000. My estimate, if you prorate the salary that we advertised the position for last time from taking it from 0.5 to 0.7 and adding another 15,000 fringes that were budgeted, this would run about $120,000. And Abdo, of course, has spent $134,000 under its contract. So for those reasons, I support the motion. Is there any other discussion? Commissioner Benny.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, Chair Brandt. And I think that one question I would have, like, one thing I've noticed with this body, with this board, is that there's nobody that I can ask a question to, right? There's nobody at the podium at a moment like this. So I think that if this were to proceed and we were to adopt this, you would be requesting of someone that they write a job description and that they post it, and who makes that happen? I mean, if this, I think, is begging the question a little bit to say that, and then would you have to oversee it and kind of manage it? Because that doesn't seem appropriate for an elected member of the board. So it sort of speaks to the fact that there isn't a staff person that's directly accountable to carry forward some of the day-to-day operational work of this board, if that makes sense. Because I think that if we do this and this needs to go to a posting, I think that one of you two will probably have to be checking in. Yep.
Commissioner Benny, and then I'll recognize Commissioner Payne, who is next. I think one of the whereas clauses authorizes the search committee, which would be members of the board, to create a job description for the position. I will point out that we had one from 2022, so it's just a fine-tuning, I would say, of that. And recognize Commissioner Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Obene made a reference to perhaps the need to have some flexibility or adaptability, especially in terms of the need to have some redundancy in how I could imagine a number of different structures. We're really fixating on this part-time role, and at least having it being a dedicated person. I think Commissioner Bene makes a very, very excellent point around having that single person who has ownership of the body of work and therefore accountability to that body of work. Whereas, when you look at the contract for Abdo, and again, this isn't about Abdo, this is about just the generic process of contracting, is you have a rate table for a partner at $445 an hour all the way down to administrative staff. And the moment that you add even just one additional person, you lose that sense of ownership and you don't know who you're emailing and who's holding the work. And so I think there's just real value to there being a single person that, even if we were to have some backfill through finance, or I'd even say to Commissioner Chugtai's point, we're currently leveraging Abdo in our audit group, which I do actually have a lot of confidence in our audit, our city auditor, in terms of structurally providing a level of independence, both from the administration and a level of independence from the legislative body as well. So we already have that independence baked in, and I could see an opportunity of this role having some sort of coordination or overlap with the city auditor in terms of what does it look like to have a full-time body of work. I would actually make a recommendation to even make an amendment to strike through the final clause in the resolution to not make this so prescriptive to say what the FTE amount ought to be. I think it should be the search committee, the job description, and the process that would then define what the appropriate workload would be, and leave some room for the flexibility of finding that backfill structure that would be able to serve both this body and make sure that whoever this one individual is, when they don't have full-time work in a given week, we have a process by which they are not underutilized.
If I could just step in on a point of information here, Commissioner Payne, may interest you to know that when this was brought forward as a half-time position in 2022, in our first go-around on this, the idea was floated of having the other half of that person's time consumed by working with the audit function for the city. And so I'll throw in that bit of perspective. And Commissioner Priest-Stinson.
I just wanted to quickly say that process wasn't too painful, but yes, the president kind of owns it. We agreed on what the job description would be. At the time. It was President, then Vice President Brandt, but President Brandt, myself, and previous budget chair Koski. We created that job description. It went to HR. It was it was very simple. Procurement handles the RFP going out. The president gets to see those as they come in. They field them once it closes. They communicated with all of us, and they made a recommendation. And I believe there really was only one option, so it made it a little easier, and we were all in agreement. But it's a pretty seamless, and it's not a lot of work really on. I'm not going to speak for someone else and say it's not that much work, but it's posting what we agree upon within this group of folks, and it wasn't too much work that. The work becomes the work. It was actually very painless, very simple and easy to do. So I just wanted to speak to that one point and to say that I would be friendly to such amendment if it was raised, as you just stated. Commissioner Payne.
If it pleases the chair, I would like to formally move an amendment to strike through this final clause within the resolution, if there is a second.
Second.
A motion has been made and seconded. Is there discussion? No discussion?
Go ahead.
Commissioner Chutai.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to say that I'm grateful that Commissioner Payne made this amendment. I'm very excited to support it. As a new person coming in, I understand there was a lot of work done in 2022 to figure out, exactly what this role could look like. But I would want to leave the committee with the search committee with the flexibility of being able to determine, does it make sense for this to be 0.5, 0.7, or 1 FTE, or some combination of an FTE and financial consultant. And I just don't think that we should be as prescriptive as to assign this. I understand the intent behind it, Mr. President, but would just say that I think that just striking this clause will both allow to accommodate what you were trying to do, along with leaving the flexibility. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion on the resolution? Commissioner Benny.
I would agree it's better that it's less prescriptive. I would also say, I just have to belabor this point. I just really, the president and the vice president of this board are not employees of the city of Minneapolis. And so doing the work as employees, and you may have to in this case, but I think that proves the point that there's a gap here in support for this board. So you shouldn't have to write a job description. You shouldn't have to follow up and make sure it's being posted. That's my opinion. So thanks.
And maybe this is an appropriate point to point out that last time when we went down this road, we did work with Mr. Goldsworthy in, I believe, HR to work on the job description. I would assume that we would do that again if this passes. All right, we have an amendment before us. Any further discussion on the amendment? If not, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, the amendment passes. We now have the resolution as amended before us. Is there any further discussion? Mayor Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to amend to include one additional paragraph that notes that the individual in this position will take direction as approved by the body. I'm happy to articulate that out in clear verbiage. So it would just say, be it further resolved that are we calling them a secretary?
Executive Secretary.
The executive secretary shall take direction as approved by the body of the Board of Estimate and Taxation, and that would just be to distinguish between taking direction from any one commissioner.
Is there a second?
And if I could just make part of this is transparency.
Well, without a second, I don't think we have.
Well, I haven't gotten to the. I'm still. If I could just make the argument as to why this is important.
I think we
I'll
had.
second it. I would like to
Okay.
second that, for
Okay,
sure.
we have a second, so go ahead, Commissioner Fry.
Part of this is transparency. We should provide direction to in the staff that we all are approving, not based on the will of one individual, whoever that individual may be, but based on discussion that we all collectively have. We reach a conclusion, there's a majority vote, just like we're doing right now, and then that employee would take direction from this board. This is not an executive system here. This is a system where we are a board and we decide as a board, we make decisions as a board, and then those decisions are carried out as a board. And so that would be the only addition that I would have, just so that this particular individual is not simply reporting to me or you or anybody else. And it also prevents this concept of conflicting directions. If we're all kind of equal partners on this board, granted from a procedural standpoint, we do have people that run the meetings, but we're equal partners. And in being equal partners, it makes sense that we don't have behind the scenes arguments that aren't seen. It's a transparent process where we give a direction and that direction is then followed.
Commissioner Chuktai?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm having a really difficult time wrapping my head around this amendment, and I oppose it. I oppose it very strongly, and I'll tell you a little bit about why. I find it to be respectfully, I find it to be incredibly ironic to hear the argument of we are a board and we should together decide, all 6 of us, the direction of one staff member from one of the strongest champions of the 14 bosses argument. So I would say we, as a body, make decisions together. We set direction together. We approve items together. And as a body, we did elect leadership here. We elected a president. We elected a vice president. And I think it's okay for the staff member to receive their day-to-day direction from the president and vice president that we elected. In fact, I think it would be incredibly concerning if we articulated that in this resolution that the new executive secretary takes direction from at the will of the entire board. If we decided that, and now the executive secretary approaches the board to say, "Can I send this email?" We have to wait for the entire board to give consent to that. That makes no sense. I think that as a board, we act and we take votes, and one of the votes we took was to elect leadership. I would say that I'd be very okay with our leadership that we elected here to oversee our new executive secretary, and I trust them. They're also solely elected to do this responsibility, and so I actually have greater trust in them than I would in myself being providing that type of direction. So just wanted to articulate why I'm opposed to this amendment. Thank you.
Commissioner Priest-Stinson.
Question for our attorney. It says that the executive secretary, there's some language around who the executive secretary reports to, or isn't there somewhere? What exactly does that say again? Just to make sure I get it right. Mr. Hamer, please.
Vice President Priest-Stinson, President Brandt, are you asking what's in the charter specifically?
I believe it says some kind of a statement around that we are allowed to have an executive secretary.
Yeah.
We can exercise that, and then there's another line that I don't remember off top.
Section 5.2 of the charter just says that the board may employ in the unclassified service an executive secretary. So there's not any more
Okay.
detail than that.
Perfect. And then the other thing that I wanted to say was, Yeah, I'm not in support of that. It feels a little micromanagey to me. We didn't do it before, but we didn't have a problem with a whole consulting service that had a whole fee schedule of things, and we didn't do it then. I do 100% believe in transparency, but this isn't necessarily transparency. This to me is more of a process thing, and I think that we can agree upon a process as a board as to what that looks like. So for example, our CFO and staff, they have a lot to do. When they're getting requests from all of us specific to this board, it could get very bogged down. So the process that we had was any requests that were required would go to me, and I would send them to our director, Deshani, so that then she could decide who on the staff was best to take that task and when they would get it done. And so to me, this is more about process and not about transparency. And I think we just need to agree on a process. And for that reason and others, I think it's best to leave it at process. And not, make it into a transparency. And yes, when everybody's in charge, no one's in charge. It gets confusing. It can be intimidating in a workplace to just, no matter how we write that, it's still going to feel like I'm not sure who I can go to and when. And it's likely just going to cause more red tape and probably less of a happiness factor of the person in the role. I just don't see it being necessary. Let's handle this through process.
Commissioner Payne.
Thank you, Mr. President. I actually first was reflecting on that amendment. I was like, oh, this seems reasonable. And then Commissioner Chugtai, you kind of talked me out of it. And then where I ended up landing as well, just like I wanted to strike through the prescriptive nature of the 0.7 FTE, just that felt a little prescriptive. But then just like Commissioner Priest-Stinson, I thought this has got to be outlined in the charter. Well, it's actually outlined in our bylaws. So the board may employ in the unclassified service an executive secretary and or an auditor. The board may employ in the classified service other such employees that it may deem necessary. No officer or member of the board may individually instruct the executive secretary or any other employee. So I think the concerns of Commissioner Fry are addressed in our bylaws. I think the bylaws are the right place to manage that kind of process question. I don't know that it necessarily needs to be articulated in this very purpose-driven resolution around building a search committee.
Commissioner Fry.
So my suggestion is 100% consistent with the argument that I've been making for years, which is you can't have multiple commissioners directing staff on a day-to-day basis. If what you're suggesting is there is one individual that is directing the day-to-day operations and that individual is the president, it's an entirely different thing. But if I'm suggesting one thing and Commissioner Bene is suggesting another thing and Commissioner Chugtai is suggesting another thing on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't work. And so what I'm suggesting is 100% consistent with what I've been arguing about 14 bosses, or in this case, 6, for quite some time. Now, we have in the past agreed to a work plan, and that work plan is passed by the body. And so if there's more consensus around that, or if that's the verbiage that works better, yeah, I would approve that. I mean, the work plan is generally something that we all can sign on to.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here before Commissioner Priest-Stinson, because I was on the verge of telling people that I would be certainly willing to commit to the board adopting a work plan to guide the work of the executive secretary. But I think the direction does need to come through one person representing the board, and it should be the president.
I agree with that.
Commissioner Priest-Stinson.
That work plan also would, just as important, ensure the success of the person in the position. So they're very clear about what's expected of them, especially during their 90-day probationary period. That would be very helpful to them. So I just wanted to lift that part up as well, and that there's a difference between providing direction and direct supervision. And so I think what we're talking about with the president is you really are supervising the person in the role and supporting them in their role to execute said work plan, and that is a lot different than so I don't think we're talking about the other thing, and we haven't, and I haven't seen it come up in my time being sitting here on this board. So yeah, I think we just need to be very clear when we're parsing out supervision and what taking direction means from being the person telling them what to do and only work on this. That's very different. So having a work plan takes care of that. We were moving forward with the work plan with ABDO, so process-wise, it makes sense that we would move forward with the work plan as well. I don't think work plan needs to be spelled out here in this resolution. I think all of that can be part of what this committee will put together as kind of the package. Can also be the suggestion of what the process should be. So we're all on the same page and in agreement about how things are going to work. But I think it could be addressed there, which would make more sense.
Okay, we have the Commissioner Fry amendment before us. Is there any further discussion? Commissioner Benny?
Yep, I flipped this up a while ago because
Sorry.
I was going to mention work plan, and so so I think we're really finding some consensus here, and I think a great model is I'm in my third year on the audit committee, and that's exactly how it's done. The other thing is the city auditor will meet with the individuals to kind of gauge interests, areas of emphasis, priorities, things like that, and then can bring that work back together for this group, this body, to decide if that's what we want to proceed with. And that I think the audit's been mentioned a few times here. I think audit's a very good model for how this could work. So, yeah.
Okay, Mayor Fry? Commissioner Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. So I'll just repeat what I understand, and I kind of, through nods of the heads, would work for me. My concern, again, was with multiple commissioners directing day-to-day operations. And so long as we're agreeing that is not the case, in fact, that would be done by the president, that alleviates one of my concerns. And so long as we're also agreeing to collectively vote for a work plan, that would alleviate the other. And so kind of through nods, I mean, we don't need to do this too formal here, so long as that's what we're agreeing to. I'll withdraw.
Okay, the motion is withdrawn. Is there any further discussion on the underlying motion? Commissioner Payne?
Thank you, Mr. President. I think Commissioner Fry's basically effectively addressed this, but we don't need to prescribe anything in this resolution. This resolution does what it needs to do, which is forming a search committee to write a job description. And then I would just say, without formally putting it into the resolution, we should, in this search committee, make sure that the bylaws are reflecting the way that we want this body to be interacting with the staff. I think work planning is fantastic. This is something that we're instituting this term on City Council, and we've just adopted the work plan, at least in committee, for PHS today, which is really good, and I think that's a really necessary step. None of those things need to be prescribed in this resolution, and so but it feels like that's the consensus that we've already arrived at, so I just wanted to make those points. Thank you.
Okay, any further discussion on the underlying amendment or the underlying motion? Okay, we have the motion as amended before us, the resolution as amended before us. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. The motion is passed, and we have completed all business to come before us, and without objection, we stand adjourned.